Hey everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Pastor Ryan Rouse, otherwise known as Decorah Bible Bookworm, and I'm so glad that you're checking out my channel. Again, please remember that you can subscribe, and it will tell you when I have a new video posted, or it should. And you can also participate in the study. Don't be shy. You can make comments and ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them if I can. So anyway, we're going to get started again this week. As the Bible study recap, we have two different texts. We have an Old Testament and a New Testament. And I wanted to let everyone know that typically I do follow the Revised Common Lectionary, but because our Sunday school doesn't follow the Revised Common Lectionary with what they're teaching the Sunday school kids, oftentimes the first lesson will be different from the Gospel. And so because we've been studying other texts for the first lesson, so I've been using those in Bible study. So our first text is from Exodus chapter 14, verses 16 through 30. Again, that's Exodus chapter 40, verses 16 through 30. And then our gospel text later will be John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. So you might want to pause the video and take a look at those beforehand. Or you can just pause it as I'm going over things. All right, so as we look at the first text, Exodus 40, 16 through 30, it's a story about Moses setting up the tabernacle. And to kind of give you a little background, remember the people were saved by Moses and God from their slavery in Egypt, and they're now in the wilderness, while they're in the wilderness, they receive the Ten Commandments, and then one of the things God informs Moses is he gives them some instructions for building a tabernacle. So we can assume the people have probably been in the wilderness for about maybe almost a year. It would have taken some time to get the resources needed to build the tabernacle. And here in Exodus 40, we have Moses following the Lord's instructions to set it up. And notice how they're just in our brief text, we see it says, as the Lord commanded him 7 times. It says Moses followed the Lord's instructions as the Lord commanded him. So Moses is following God's command and is following his instructions. As I was reading the story, it made me think back to days when I used to go camping with my family. I haven't really done that as an adult, but definitely when I was growing up, we'd go camping. And I'm not talking about camping with an RV. I'm talking about going to a campground, having to find a campsite, and then unrolling the tent and following. Sometimes we had instructions to follow to set that tent up, and building, making sure the tent was set up, and then unrolling our sleeping bags and just unloading the car and, basically setting up a camp. So it reminded me of that as I was reading about Moses in this story. And he does a lot of work. And as we think about setting up this tabernacle, the tabernacle was a place kind of for God among the people. Earlier God had been with Moses on the mountain, and now God was with the people, and he was in this special place, this tabernacle. I imagine it was a big tent, and you can picture that maybe. The Bible offers better detail than I can. But anyway, so as you look at the story, Moses, again, he follows the Lord's command to set up the tabernacle. And then the Lord is present in that tabernacle during the day. That God is there. There's a cloud. And then at night there's a cloud with fire. And so God is present there. And then if God moved on, that was kind of a sign for the people to move on. And so they would tear the tabernacle down, or so to speak, and then they would move along, and then they would set it up again. Imagine that was a lot of work. But I think there's great imagery to be found in this story. As we think about the idea of God being mobile, so often these days we think about God being found in certain buildings. Of course, we think of God being found in a church or maybe a synagogue, and this idea that God was present in this mobile structure, and it's a good reminder that God isn't always in buildings that are permanent, like made of brick or wood. And so We can, God can be found wherever our wilderness setting is. So, and of course, hopefully you believe God can be found out in the world, out in the wilderness even. But I just like this idea of God being mobile. Now notice the importance of all the different items that Moses puts in that tabernacle. There's all these items that are a part of worshiping God. And many of these things remind me of things that are used in Christian worship. In churches today, there's all sorts of important items that can be found as you're worshiping on Sunday mornings or whenever your church worships. Maybe you worship on a Saturday night. And I think about, of course, we have the altar, and the altar is where we have the where communion takes place. You have the bread and the wine. Oftentimes the offering is placed upon the altar. And then, of course, a lot of churches nowadays have a baptismal font, which is usually found as you're entering into the sanctuary. And it's a way for you to remember your baptism. And some of these images are found in this story. You have a table that bread is placed upon. And then you also have a basin filled with water, both great images. And of course you have an altar where the sacrifices are made, the blood sacrifices. Of course now the blood and the bread are, we think of communion, bread and wine. So anyways, just kind of neat imagery. And I invite you to take some time the next time you're at worship to think about what particular items are used in worship and the importance of them. I know that when I took my course on worship in seminary, it opened my eyes. And now as I sit and worship, I see the Paschal candle, or I see the altar, or I see a banner with Alpha and Omega, and all sorts of, there's just so many different wonderful images to be found. And there's a purpose behind it all, even the colors that are used. So just neat to connect that with this story that we're reading today from Exodus. Now, in that tent, you have the ark, and inside that ark were the commandments. That's where the commandments were placed. And then on top of the ark was God's mercy seat. So that can be found there. And then you see that, and I already said the foreshadowing of communion. I'm glancing down every once in a while to look at my notes. And then there's even incense, which we don't really use in our church, but incense is offered up to God as a fragrant offering, and I think that's just neat too. As I was reading about all this work that Moses put into following the Lord's command to set up this tabernacle, it made me think about our worship at church. Many of you probably don't know this, but there's a lot of planning and a lot of setup that needs to take place for worship to happen each week. At our church, for example, it may be not physical, because we have a building space, but a lot of it's getting people, making sure that we have greeters, ushers. Altar Guild makes sure that the bread and the wine is that there's going to be enough for everybody, and they get it all ready, especially if we're, instead of doing intinction, if we're doing full-blown communion, when we have bread and then we have the little cups of wine. So all that work that takes place reminds me of what Moses does in our story from Exodus. So just think about that next time you're at worship. What's involved with getting your worship space ready? And what's involved in getting your heart ready for worship? All right. Good. This video might actually be a little bit shorter. So our next text we're going to look at is from John. It's John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, as I mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to put out my notes a little bit for me to glance down. All right. So this is the very first revelation, as we look at our story, the first revelation of the greater things promised by Jesus at the end of chapter 1 of John. When he's calling his disciples, he says that they will see greater things. And now, not only will the followers of Jesus see these greater things, but the Jews, the non-Jews, men, women, children, will all hear and see the great things that Jesus is talking about. And in our story today, this is one of the very first great things he does. And I love this story from John. It's one of my favorite stories. I have a lot, but this is Jesus' first miracle, as reported by John, the Gospel of John, and it's filled with such deep and amazing things for us to discover that reveal who Jesus is. When Jesus first came onto the scene, when he began his ministry, the religious leaders wondered by what authority he did these things. Like how did Jesus do these things? But, by what authority? That was a big thing. Where did his power and his authority come from? And they questioned his identity. And in our story, we are given kind of a glimpse in Jesus' first miracle of who he really is and what he will do. Because keep in mind, he provides enough wine, and that wine is a symbol of joy and a symbol of abundance. But we'll come back to that. Now, today's story, or today's text, is given during Epiphany. It's following the baptism of our Lord. And remember, Epiphany is the revelation of Jesus to all the nations. And it starts off with, the wise men visiting Jesus. And the wise men symbolized the Gentiles, that Jesus came not just for the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. So Epiphany to me is about revelation, revealing who Jesus is. So we see again Jesus is revealed as the Son of God in his baptism, and then today we see him performing this amazing miracle. Now, this text is also used at weddings, which probably wouldn't surprise you. Why not have a story about Jesus at a wedding be a text at a wedding? And actually, after I became ordained, one of my very first weddings was done at a vineyard, and the couple chose this text, which I just thought that was amazing. And how appropriate it is for two people to join together in holy matrimony as they begin their new life together with Jesus there to celebrate. Back then at the wedding at Cana, and at each and every wedding. I know that this text was used at my own wedding, actually, now that I think about it. Now, not only is Jesus a guest at the party, but later we see his role changes from guest to kind of a savior, or he saves the day. He rescues the bridegroom and the family from embarrassment, from shame. Weddings back then, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but weddings back then could last up to 7 days. And oftentimes, friends and family would send bottles of wine, and they would offer up food items to prepare for the celebration, especially those that were in the wedding. And so, perhaps this is from Brian Stoffergan, perhaps this idea that with the wine running out is, maybe it's a suggestion that the bridegroom and his or her family, well, his family, the bridegroom, perhaps they didn't have friends, or many friends, or they just didn't plan. Maybe they underestimated how many guests are going to be there, or they underestimated the guests' thirst. I mentioned earlier that wine is a symbol of joy, and how bad is it that at the wedding celebration and which is supposed to celebrate this couple joining together, that the joy has already run out. So anyway, we see that Jesus, of course, saves the day. Now, Jesus steps in, and I like how initially his mother tells him to kind of save the day, and at first he kind of thinks about it, and it's kind of like, what is this to me, or what is this to you and me? But eventually, he listens to his mother, and he ends up commanding the servants to take these empty jars and fill them with water, and then he performs this amazing miracle. He transforms this water into wine, and it's not just any wine. This is amazing wine, as we see in the reaction of the steward later, who tastes it and wonders, why wasn't this wine served first? Now, notice that there's enough wine for the rest of the celebration. There's an abundance of wine. So kind of a symbol of there's an abundance of joy, and there's an abundance, and I think this connects later when Jesus says, I came so that you may have life and have it what? Abundantly. So kind of similar to our old lesson text from Exodus, we see, in that text, Moses is following the instructions of God. He's doing as the Lord commanded him. And the servants in our story are told to follow Jesus' instructions. And so they're, to do what he says. And when they listen to him and do what he says, this miracle takes place, which makes me kind of think about our lives, that we're called to do what the Lord commands us. And oftentimes if we follow what the Lord commands us to do, miracles can take place. For example, we're called to go out and share the good news of the gospel. And sometimes when we're willing to do that, when we're willing to share our faith, sometimes it makes a difference in people's lives. We don't always see it, but you never know. We might transform someone just like Jesus transforms those water jars and the water inside of that. Because that's another thing I was thinking about as I was looking at this text. Yes, we focus on the water being transformed into wine, but I was thinking as I was preparing for this study that he also kind of transforms the use of these purification jars. They were used for purification and washing, and all of a sudden now they're holding this wine, this symbol of joy for the wedding, and I think about how that wine also being in the purification jars, if it purifies, what does the wine at communion do for us? It purifies us. And again, Jesus provides enough wine for the wedding. Now, again, they follow his instruction. Jesus tells them to fill those purification jars with water, to fill those jars. And the only other time we find this word fill is later on in John's gospel when the disciples fill baskets from the feeding of the 5,000. And they fill it with bread and leftover bread. Maybe some leftover fish, but bread. So we have fill at Cana with wine, and we have fill at the feeding of the 5,000 with bread. Bread, wine. Great communion foreshadowing. Now, Jesus transforms, we'll get back to this idea that he does transform what's inside the container. And perhaps it's a good reminder for us to remember that no matter how old we are, Jesus can transform our hearts. Those purification jars were old. They'd probably been around for a while, but he's still able to use those. So no matter how old we may be, Jesus can use us. He can take a sinner also. He can take what's inside of us and he can turn it. He can turn a sinner into a saint. And I like that imagery too. So often, we think about sin and how it affects us. And we think it's the outside things that affect us. And even Jesus says it's not what is outside of a person that defiles, but it's what's inside the person. And I think that this is another reason why communion is so important for us. What do we do at communion? Communion, we receive forgiveness of sin. But one of the things we do, from a Lutheran perspective, we believe that we are ingesting both the body and the bread, and we're ingesting the wine and the blood. We're ingesting Christ. So as we ingest Christ, he's able to transform. He's able to help us with that inside stuff that defiles us. Now, after the water is transformed, what happens? The steward tastes it, and we're given an excellent example of what can happen in our own lives through the faith that God has so graciously bestowed upon us. And this was mentioned in our Bible study, so I have to share it with you. Although our lives may not always be great, they may not always be perfect, sometimes they're downright difficult. Sometimes it's like that first wine in the text, the wine that isn't as good. Sometimes our lives are that way. But the miracle at Cana is a reminder that the better life is yet to come. That through Christ, our lives can be transformed. They're not always going to be perfect, but we have the wine, the better wine that's going to come. We have the new life that is available to us when Christ comes again, when we celebrate at that wedding feast. And I think this is hinted at the very beginning of our story when it says on the third day. You know, maybe the writers meant to intend that, yes, it's a third day, but I also look at the third day. When was Christ raised? On the third day. Well, I hope you ponder all this insight into Scripture. Hopefully it opened your eyes to some things, and I look forward to you joining me for another video. Take care and God bless. Bye-bye.